Hi, this is Professor Favors with American Literature. So today's topic is on Nella Larsen's Sanctuary. And Larsen's work is part of Modernism and add to it Harlem Renaissance. This particular presentation lecture includes scholarly perspectives and MLA formatting examples. So this is American Literature, Nella Larsen's Sanctuary. This lecture is subject to fair use. Nella Larsen, 1891 to 1964. So Nella Larsen is a groundbreaking figure in American history, trained professionally as both a nurse and a librarian. Larsen is the first African American to receive a degree from a School of Library Science in the United States, and the first African American woman to receive a Guggenheim Fellowship. She is also the first African American author to publish a short story titled Sanctuary. In the two novels and single short stories she published over the course of her brief writing career, Larsen drew upon her personal history of living as a woman on both sides of the color line to explore nothing less than the experience of race, class, gender, and sexuality in the early 20th century. Larsen was born in Chicago to a Danish immigrant mother and a Caribbean father. After her father abandoned the family, her mother remarried a fellow Dane, leaving Larsen as the only black member of a white household, attending separate schools than her white half sister, and also living for years in Denmark with her white relatives. Leaving Chicago during her teens, Larsen enrolled in the racially segregated high school associated with Fisk University, and then worked as head nurse of the Tuskegee Institute School of Nursing. However, she chafed at what she saw as the limited mission and puritanical culture of these black institutions, even criticizing them in her loosely autobiographical novel, Quicksand. So, about Sanctuary, which was published in 1930, after publishing two successful novels and winning a Guggenheim, the publication of Sanctuary in the form should have been another step upwards in Larsen's career. Instead, it embroiled Larsen in controversy and was the last thing she ever published. Readers of Larsen's tale pointed out great similarities between it and a story published 8 years earlier by Sheila K. Smith, Mrs. Addis. Both stories have the same plot, similar dialogue, and the same ironic ending. However, K. Smith's story takes place in Sussex, England, and features two white working class characters. Larsen's similarly plotted tale takes place in the American South and features two black working class characters. While both Larsen and the editors of the forum defended the story, Larsen could not find a publisher for the novel she wrote during her Guggenheim Fellowship. She divorced her husband for infidelity in 1933 and returned to her first career of nursing for the remainder of her life. So let's look at the historical implications. Remember, from 19th to 20th century, so we actually do have new. Don't forget that Jim Crow as a character was created in 1828 through Thomas Dartmouth Rice. Andrew Jackson became president in 1829. There was the anti-slavery sentiment, which describes the abolitionist movement, Nat Turner's revolt, slavery debates, Oberlin College uh, enrolling female students, Florida and Texas becoming states, Mexican American War. Then we have the Fugitive Slave Act, Dred Scott v. Sanford decision. Of course, the American Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation, Reconstruction era, assassination of Lincoln, and then all of the different amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. The abolitionist movement officially ends in and around 1870. 1865 to 1913 are industrial revolutions, moving from primarily relying on an agricultural economy to now a manufacturing economy. And so 1877, Jim Crow laws are created. So even though Jim Crow as a character was created in 1828. Laws began 1877, which uh, which which enforced racial segregation. We also have the National American Women Suffrage Association in 1890. Along with that was the Separate Car Act, which um, made equal but separate accommodations constitutional. There were challenges to that particular law. So that came with 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson, to determine the constitutionality of racial segregation. Then, of course, all this, we have the Spanish American War. So now we were introduced from the previous lecture, but we're now continuing this. From 1910 to 1970, the Great Migration, where blacks escaped poverty and Jim Crow laws. We have the beginning of Harlem Renaissance, 1910 to 1930s. Then we have our world wars. So World War I, 1914 to 1918. Don't forget the 19th Amendment. So here it is in 1920, women's right to vote 2 years after World War One. The Great Depression in 1929. We do reference Harlem Race Riot in this lecture, so that was 1935. So that's going to be after the publication of Sanctuary. World War II, 1939 to 1945. And then, of course, Brown v. Board of Education rules that separate but equal is unconstitutional. So let's review Jim Crow laws, segregation of whites, persons of color, because it sort of defines the purpose behind Great Migration. So again, Jim Crow laws, 1877 to 1950, technically 1954, but it enforced racial segregation between the end of the Reconstruction period to the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. And don't forget that it was based upon this idea: anyone ascertainable or strongly suspected of Black ancestry, that person would be deemed a person of color. So that meant separation of whites from persons of color in different areas of life, which which prevented contact between blacks and whites. And then Jim Crow laws were codified by the decision with Plessy v. Ferguson that separate but equal doctrine is constitutional. So let's recap Jim Crow timeline. So Thomas Dartmouth Rice creates the minstrel character Jim Crow. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. Hall v. DeCure rules that states cannot prohibit segregation on carriers. The Supreme Court declares the Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional. Louisiana Separate Car Act requires equal but separate accommodations. Um, May 18th, U.S. Supreme Court upholds the Separate Car Act in the Plessy v. Ferguson, solidifying the Jim Crow era, which then expands to segregation in schools, businesses, sports, churches, hospitals, all ways of life. And then came along 1954, the Board of Education made separate but equal unconstitutional, which produced many more um, statutes. So Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, Loving v. Virginia, and these advances ended the Jim Crow era. So let's recap: Introduction to Modernism, Reinventing the World. So your historical drivers: World War One was the biggest driver for modernism. It is considered the Great War. World War One was a European conflict with Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Allied forces, and then Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, Central Powers. And it was considered the first global war and first fully industrialized war. So within that war, um, there were shelling, machine guns, mustard gas, advanced weaponry. And then tensions rose when Adolf Hitler came to power, so that sparked the World War II, and the United States was forced to enter World War II because of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. The Second World War resulted in American growth, immigration, industrialization, technological developments. And then that revolution gave rise to factories moving the country from agricultural to industrial base. The invention of the automobile and the assembly line in the early 1920s created an industry, spurred investments into infrastructure, and made personal travel available. And then the Great Depression happened, 1929, which was the result of a market collapse, creating an economic downturn in which banks shut down, workers became unemployed, and droughts led to becoming homeless looking for work. So then we needed presidential intervention after that Great Depression, which was 1932. Roosevelt ushered in the New Deal, creating the Works Progress Administration, which used federal funds to put people to work, building America's infrastructure and providing employment. It addressed poverty in the American South. Although these funds did address poverty, people began moving from agricultural areas into cities, marking the period um, as the Great Migration, in which Black Americans left the South to escape poverty and Jim Crow laws. They moved to cities such as Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, New York, and this served as a major population shift in American history, resulting in cultural cross pollination, cultural revolutions, and the Harlem Renaissance. So there are some literary considerations that you need to be aware of. So modernism is a catch-all for global movement. Again, always remember that literary writers always respond to whatever is going on at that time. And so at this time, they were responding to the wars of the period. And this is when they felt that writers felt betrayed by the United States. They questioned the truths of the past, the status quo. They were highly disaffected. And then there are different types of literary styles and genres. So, in referencing poetry, high modernism and low modernism. High modernism focused on the formal, examining how much America has changed and shifted and become fragmented and disjointed. And then low modernism experimented with form. Prose, both fiction and nonfiction, focus on writers challenging form, style, and content. These writers tended to be explicit in their political critiques. The Great Depression gave rise to communism, while the women's suffrage movement spurred early feminism. And then there was the dissemination of paperback books and magazines meant that writers were reaching a wider audience. So let's bring in the Harlem Renaissance, the beginnings, branches, and Black Pride. So the Harlem Renaissance, key dates. The date is technically longer than this, but there's some consistency in representing this period, and so it seems like it's from 1910s to 1930s. And so the Great Migration of African American populations, about 30,000, migrated from the south to the north. This developed the Harlem neighborhood as a Black cultural mecca. African American culture created for or depicted in literature, music, stage, performance, and art. Collapse of the plantation economy, close of the western frontier, development of city dwellings. So in Sanctuary, you're going to see at the beginning of the read a reference to plantation. Migratory patterns led to creation of regional identities and cultural identities. So where's the Harlem Race Riot situated, which we will get into, is between two wars. And so keep that in mind as we look at Harlem Renaissance. So Harlem Renaissance from unity to disunity. So Harlem Renaissance is really divided by two branches: the first branch and the second branch. So the first branch focused primarily on idealized principles of American democracy. It was European focused. It celebrated the achievement of African Americans. Key figures were County Cullen and Jesse Redmond Fawcett, who were highly and traditionally educated. They descended from the English literary tradition of the 18th and 19th centuries. So when we finished the American Civil War, you found literary writers trying to, sort of distance themselves from the previous literary traditions of the British and the English, and they began to write from an American lens. The Harlem Renaissance sort of had, in the first branch, African Americans who wanted to kind of return to that European focus. So then the second branch argued for literature that responded to the writers of African heritage versus European connection. So there was more of a focus on what um, African ancestry spoke through writing. The goal was regarded the manifesto of Pan Africanism movement, emphasizing unity and solidarity of people of African descent, and then the key figures were Richard Wright, Langston Hughes, and Zora Neale Hurston. So this is how it moved from unity to disunity, because more under the first branch was this sort of highly stylized um, intellectual undertaking of how to represent society within a literary work, and it focused primarily on European lens. However, the movement towards uh, African heritage and African influences created also the disunity between the literary writers of the Harlem Renaissance. So, Black Pride movement and literary consideration. So, the goal was need to get credit. Black Americans need to get the credit they deserve for cultural areas of life. So, we have poetry, Claude McKay's collection of Harlem Shadows, which details the experiences of Black prostitutes in the U.S., a novel, Jean Toomer's Cane, um, explores origins and experiences of African Americans in the U.S. Fiction, James Weldon Johnson's The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, details experiences of a young biracial man living in the post-Reconstruction era. A novel, again, Jesse Redmond Fawcett's There Is Confusion, that explores Black Americans finding a cultural identity in white dominated Manhattan. And then, of course, poetry, County Cullen's Color, which was the first published book of poetry. And it details childhood experiences of racism. Cullen received also a Guggenheim Fellowship for his poetry. Black Pride. So then we have American music, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, Waller, and Cap Calloway. The Cotton Club, white people created a separate establishment to experience Black culture without socializing with African Americans. The community disagreed with this club, but some believe that it was a way for Black culture to move toward acceptance, mainly social acceptance. Remember the separate car, the Plessy v. Ferguson, with the separate car accommodations, separate but equal accommodations, suggested that Black folks do not have legal inferiority, they have social inferiority. And so here it is, you have Black people, African Americans, wanting to receive acceptance from a larger or, or from the status quo. And so they co signed, in a sense, this type of club, Cotton Club, which is, really offensive too at the same time. Paul Robeson, actor, singer, writer, activist. Josephine Baker, Black musical review performer, French. Aaron Douglas, visual Black artist, the father of Black American art. Marcus Garvey, Black nationalist of the Pan Africanism movement, published Negro World. He had a shipping company, created trade between Africans in America, the Caribbean, South, and Central America, Canada, and Africa. And then we have the Harlem Race Riot, which was the death knell for the Harlem Renaissance, which set the stage for the Civil Rights Movement. So let's look at racial tensions. So the Harlem Renaissance racial tensions. There's a context here: Harlem Race Riot, March 19th, and then don't forget the historical context. So this race riot happens at a time where we have left one war. We are now experiencing the Great Depression, and then we're about to enter another war. And so for the Harlem Race Riot, it is based upon a teenager who stole a penknife from a store. And the riot is fueled by economic hardship, racial injustice, community mistrust of the police, and that it is also considered the first modern American race riot. So let's look at the backstory. By the 1930s, African Americans had made strides for equality since Reconstruction, with the first African American elected to Congress and Congress of Industrial Organizations admitting the first to admit Black people to the Union. Racial inequality persisted, however. The Great Depression affected the nation economically, leaving millions of people out of work. African Americans continued to experience institutional racism, which included redlining practices, unfair renting practices, falling property values, and employment discrimination. Puerto Ricans gained citizenship in 1917 around this time, prior to this riot. The city of New York um, was perceived as neglecting Harlem, so that meant its playgrounds, public facilities, and they were the last on the list for repair. On March 19, Lino Rivera, 16-year-old Black Puerto Rican, was caught stealing a penknife from a dime store. The owner called the police. Officers arrived. Crowds gathered. The storekeeper became afraid and let Rivera go. The officers agreed with the storekeeper. So that seems like that should have been it. But there was a rumor. So a rumor circulated that police had beaten or killed Rivera, leading to more than 10,000 people taken to the streets in protest. They perceived the police brutality as racially motivated, which contributed to Black frustrations. The protests led to rioting, destruction of property, and looting. Storekeepers made their cases for protecting their properties with signs like Black owned and we employ Black people. All white police tried to regain control, but the protesters fought them. After the protests, there were 125 people arrested, 100 injured, and 3 dead. Property damage in excess of 2 million. New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia appointed a biracial commission to investigate the disturbance, later suppressing the findings because of what it suggested about Black New Yorkers. Instead, the mayor championed Black causes and included a small number in his local government. Although the mayor worked to expand opportunities for Black Americans, 2 more riots and protests followed, which were Harlem Race Riot in 1943 and Harlem Race Riot in 1964. Again, these are sort of the particular activities that fuel the civil rights protests or civil rights movements. And so these are the works consulted. Um, this is Introduction to Modernism, Nella Larsen's Sanctuary, Harlem Renaissance in 2 places, Harlem Race Riot. And then the journal article is only available as a PDF in the classroom. It's not available. It's one of those purchased items, or with me being a faculty member, I only have access to it. And so when you upload it, it's uploaded in the classroom, and so you should be able to have access to it. In the journal article, plagiarism and unethical practices. So don't forget Jim Crow, Britannica Jim Crow information, Jim Crow laws, Spanish American War, glossary of literary terms, point of view, entry for Plessy v. Ferguson, Separate Car Act, Emancipation Proclamation, and then the causes and effects of the American Civil War. All right, so here, Nella Larsen resources. There is a Britannica entry, Nella Larsen, American author. Bibliography, there are a lot of bibliography works on Nella Larsen. So there's a JSTOR, which requires a subscription. And then there's Oxford Bibliographies, what you can get some information about, and then but it's going to be restricted after a certain time. Then you have primary and secondary works. This is a site that I think that has a lot more information. And then there's a biography, which is usually in the form of a library guide. So these are Nella Larsen um, resources. All right, this is the end of the lecture. Thank you very much for listening.